Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 41st paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz Vom Kriege, its title being Former Contradictions. The text follows. Because this simplicity of knowledge requisite in war was not attended to, but that knowledge was always jumbled up with the whole impedimenta of subordinate sciences and arts, therefore, the palpable opposition to the events of real life which resulted could not be solved otherwise than by ascribing it all to genius, which requires no theory, and for which no theory could be prescribed. So this is a very simple but important paragraph, because in here von Clausewitz is summing up the problems that substantially had characterized the first formulation of a theory of the art of war, historically speaking, at the beginning, right, up to his days. Like the idea that, almost at least up to his days, it is the idea that, okay, we should concentrate on literally, like, things are complex, fine, we should expand the knowledge on literally everything at a given moment so that we can start build a theory, not on the base of what we derive properly from the observation of this data as such, but just by, I can't say gathering this data, obviously, because there is still an analysis, but still essentially being content with disposing of a lot of them and trying to make them fit into something, broadly functional, right, as the theory of art of war is supposed to be in the first place. And it did go wrong. Like, there are different ways of doing this. Like, I probably didn't define it cent for cent, because you may say, well, then what should we do? Should we ignore essentially everything? Well, no. And this is a bit the paradox. The concept is, as always in the Clausewitzian theory, from one side you should know as much as you can, and possibly understanding as much as you can. But, realistically speaking, you can't. Right? I mean, we could try to solve a system so complex as war by literally studying every single thing that appears to be there in a way or another. And we're talking literally about every single damn thing, even just physically speaking. Right? And concentrating, that's what, theory had began to do, essentially, on the material side of the story. That is to say, okay, well, there are certain things that are kind of even unpredictable, like human behavior, for example. And therefore, like, let's focus just on what we can measure, physically speaking, mathematically speaking, right? Aside from the fact that there is an actual difficulty to do that too, because not even science is not opposite to this idea. Science shows us constantly that it's not that we can dominate everything, and we can control everything, we can even presume to know everything, even about a determinate thing. There are constant reconsiderations about everything. The fact that you find, physical law, well, that doesn't tell you, well, okay, you achieved something important, but that doesn't grant you that you are, for example, always in the condition of applying that knowledge to reality. And at that point, what do you have your physical law for, right? In that specific case, of course, that can serve for many other aspects, but still in the way you have to, build bridges and skyscrapers or make a plane fly. Well, that doesn't pass through, an abstract notion that can be as, precise as you can, but that not necessarily will help you to do certain things. You have to think beyond, right? And von Clausewitz in this paragraph actually concentrates in over aspects that in this sense are properly detached from the theory of the art of war as basically the employment of armed forces proper, right? Saying that there are other factors that are substantially aside this, that the way you properly employ the armed forces that conceptually speaking are separated from the theory of the art of war proper, right? You can't, for example, think about, I mean, as a general, von Clausewitz has already made this distinction at some point, like to pre-order how logistics will, I mean, you shouldn't even care about that, because as a commander, you should already work with the system that is logistically served, and if it's not the case, right, you are, even if you, work for it, which happens because commanders do that most of the times, in certain circumstances at least, well, that's still detached, that's still separated from the theory of the art of war proper. A logist will do that, a commander will do something else. And the two things are important as long as they're conceptually separated, because what von Clausewitz is saying is that there was a lot of confusion essentially arising from pretending that all of these aspects, whichever they were, whether strictly military or, other things like knowing how to dig a trench, which is essentially engineering, right, that has nothing to do with how you wage war properly, right, as conceptually mixed, right? If you do that and you pretend to draw a picture that takes into consideration every single damn thing you can even think of, like even how are the medicines that you use to cure wounded soldiers on the field, at that point you basically you lose the plot concerning what effectively is required to command an army to hopefully to victory, right? These are separated things, and that's why we're talking about theory in here. It's not that the two things do not interfere, they always interfere. Logistics plays an enormous part in the way armies work, but still, it pertains to another field than the one of military theory. And this is a very important conceptual distinction. We've seen it now in the previous paragraphs very, very often. And it has substantially to do with the clearance of every impedimenta, as von Clausewitz calls them here, right, that can essentially distract the commander from what he has to do. We have already observed pretty, this is self-evident, but von Clausewitz has exemplified it on several occasions, how the higher up you rise in the ranks of an army, and the more essentially commanders get detached from what is actually happening on the field, because the commander cannot start calculating on how many shells fly over the heads of their soldiers on the trench. That is something that, it's contained in the theory of the art of war, ideally in the sense that that general already knows that certain things take place. But that's exactly the point. There is a simplification of knowledge, as we have seen in the, well, actually not the previous paragraph, but the 39th, that point is required. Because to a army commander, like a divisional commander, whether a soldier is skilled doesn't make basically any difference, right? It can make in certain contexts, whether the mission maybe is surgically planned and everything is very precise and there are a few men employed, but that's something very different. When you're actually waging war on a large scale, we at the top must be able to abstract to be detached, let's say better, because the concreteness of the awareness that stems from knowing what's going on in general, even in the practicalities of war, is necessary, evidently, right? But it has to be a synthesis. It has to be essentially looking at and this is where it gets tricky, because it's not that by eliminating these factors, these elements from the horizon, everything becomes actually easier in absolute terms when you rise up through the ranks. The more you rise, on the contrary, we have seen it, the more difficult decisions that require actually an enormous amount of data compared to what the soldier is actually doing on the field is required, right? A commander-in-chief of an army must be a freaking intellectual talent. It can't be and have a lot of other qualities, including, cold-blooded determination. I mean, certain things we have seen from Clausewitz here that has explained to us, but let's say at a strictly theoretical level, in terms of complexity of the system he's analyzing, actually that person has a much tougher system to decipher, which is impossible to decipher fully anyway, by definition, than the soldier. Doesn't matter the soldier is risking his own life. The way he does it is dramatically simpler than what is happening, at the upper echelons, when lots of data have to be considered. Also because what happens in there, decisionally speaking, is also what effectively decides whether that soldier, as well as thousands of others, will be dead the day after or not. Right? So this is where we're getting. That's why von Clausewitz is stating this. It's that, now quoting the text, he wrote, because the simplicity of knowledge requisite in war was not attended to, but that knowledge was always jumbled up with the whole impedimenta of subordinate sciences and arts, therefore the palpable opposition to the events of real life which resulted could not be solved otherwise by ascribing it all to genius, which requires no theory and for which no theory could be prescribed. This is the thing. As we've seen, it's a paradox. Von Clausewitz is telling us that that type of theory that wished to take into consideration everything, realistically, I mean literally, is, as ineffective as much as it's tested with reality. And that's why, effectively, in reality, it doesn't quite happen in that regard. Because even though comes from that background and is completely unprepared to cope with reality in that way, in the way it really is, still will not respond in this, theoretically framed picture, but will essentially be obliged to deal with reality very, very much more concretely and with a sort of intuition, fundamentally, that can't be framed properly in a theory, right? And ingenuity and lots of other things that that's why we are talking about an art of war and not a science of war, because you have to deal with a situation with all you have, which may be something completely out of man. I mean, how many things happened that were not planned, right? And that for this reason, I mean, we knew they could happen theoretically, but we were not ready for. That's the point. That's essentially what is going to affect the actual engagement of someone in war, independently from what is that this person has learned before. That's why the previous paragraph we have read was actually, this explains the connected, by the way, to the simplification of knowledge, why there is such rapid growth of great general, and why a general is not a man of learning. Some of the generals are just a bunch of, simpletons that have never opened a book in their lives, right? Many generals are actually extremely well-educated people, but at that from that point of view, from a strictly military theoretical point of view, most generals, von Clausewitz says, are actually not so schooled, militarily speaking, in at least in those in that pedantic way that an omnicomprehensive and positive theory of the art of war would actually suggest, or would actually wish to be like. So it's quite of an interesting realization that I know it's always counterintuitive. I mean, all of this thing is not so easily digestible. I know how to say this properly, but I do realize the first time you hear it, you say, but there is something that seems rather a bit equilibristic, maybe at a logical level, but it's really not. It's really not, because the problem with reality is exactly this balance between this sort of preparation that you must have before, but as much as the other qualities that even, for example, the best schooled person out there in military affairs may not have, and actually very often doesn't. Right, and that's also why, as an advice, generally speaking, when you look at military history, you never judge, like, it's very actually, and Von Clausewitz says this, that it's very difficult to evaluate the actual capability of a general before he is tested on the field, and even at that point you can really say whether, one success was due because to the general ability or to other factors. Because if that was so simple, right, it's obvious that there are great generals that you can trust in many ways, and that there are situations that overall are kind of, let's say, fairly easy, fairly simple, at least, and they pass down to history as fundamentally clear strategical pictures that, but by the way, at the time, however, weren't, right? And but at the same time, we get a bit of this falsification of the picture, right, which is not likely compared to the actual outcome, right? Von Clausewitz says that even if that we basically don't know, even as historians, what the hell happened on a battlefield after the battle has finished, right? And there are lots of problems, not just in terms of sheer, cognitive or, in fact, intellectual problems of really realizing what happens on battlefield while you're there, but naturally, the way this story is told. What do you think? That we know military history largely because we, especially in certain ages, because we have fairly reliable accounts. If it's evident that, I don't know, for the ancient world, or maybe a bit less for the medieval world, but it's very easy to find a source that states something, and that's basically all we have. And we tell history in that base, and that's how literally most history works. And sometimes it's more like analyzing not a fairy tale, but something that could be easily false, right? Not because that source maybe doesn't tell us anything true about it. Even from lies you can get a lot of truth. That's what these are the interesting paradoxes that get in the place. But it's rather saying, I don't know, that general lost that battle. Well, simply he was worse than that other guy. We don't know it most of the times, and it's very difficult to find a military context where you really have, not excessively, but it's there is always a margin for debate relatively to what, and in fact, to what happened really also at the decisional level, right? Sometimes we tend to overestimate generals. That's another thing we do all the time. We all have, by studying military history, our favorite, like, I don't know, I like this commander, I like this other, whatever. And well deservedly so. It's obvious that military history is not a mist, a cloud where we don't clearly understand much. Apparently, though, because in part it is like that, and we tend to overestimate commanders as complete geniuses simply on the base of how intelligent, on how they actually understood at the time, which is different from saying how intelligent they were, because you can be even very, very intelligent, but if you don't have enough information, for example, and you can't have it, or you have a wrong one, you can make mistakes even if you're very, very intelligent, right? And there are lots of other factors that intervene that are not even strictly intellective, right? Von Clausewitz is the first to say, like, that reason and intelligence are basically the single most important things in war, and that war approximates to a clash between, yes, intelligences in some ways, but intelligences that are driven, for example, as well. So it's never about intelligence itself. There is also determination, basically at an equal level, because you also have to make maybe a brilliant intuition to be followed by action, right? So it's very difficult for many contexts to even realize how much certain guys were doing. I mean, there are certain things, for example, in war, that are done because you're forced to do them, right? And sometimes it has nothing even to do with, in fact, the strategical picture of the story. Like, think about World War II and the race that Allies made between probably the Western Allies and the Soviets, for example, and how they threw themselves sometimes in the meat grinder without knowing how it would have been. I mean, think about Operation Torch and the conquest of North Africa and Italy. I mean, there weren't things that even the Western Allies knew so easily. That there were many, these were big decisions. Churchill wanted to invade the Balkans, notoriously, to get to Romania, and that wasn't done. Or think about just the Soviets just poured in everything they had. And in 1944, that's actually the closest they got even to a coup, actually, because there were such enormous human losses, and I mean huge human losses on the Eastern Front for the Soviets, that even Stalin, that actually was at the peak of his power, at one point risked that Stavka for kind of to rebel, to make a revolution at that point, because and just for what, for getting to Berlin first, right? So at that point, that's really what shows you, for example, what's the political. I mean, the Cold War had already began, right? Even before the end of World War II, and that tells you brilliantly, by the way, how truly war is nothing else but an instrument of politics. It's not that certain things are done just because you have thoroughly planned them, therefore you know everything before, because that would require such a huge amount of time and resources you don't have. Most things that take place in war are done just either we have to do them, and part of what makes it work is actually that the enemy generally war is asymmetrical by definition in every single historical reality, but things can go so differently from what you expected anyway, that even the enemy is brought to cope with certain situations that are always kind of unknown, right? And it's it's dramatic how effectively war is waged in this regard. And but yeah, I mean, that gives you the idea really of the instrument, of something you have to throw in to make things work, even if there is not enough time to realize certain things. And the unknown, the fog of war proper, is what how can you solve that? And don't worry, though. This is what von Clausewitz is really telling you, because you should worry in the sense that it depends on how much willing you are to do certain things for. That's why von Clausewitz thinks that war is essentially a clash between, and correctly so, a clash between moral forces, because it's at that point it's how much you're committed to risk your lives, or depending, also you can risk much less, etc. To participate into something you already know will work differently from what you have foreseen by definition. And in that regard, it's not that the enemy knows it better, like more or less, yes, he can do, but still he is in the same situation by approximation, because he also doesn't know. So that's paradoxically within that fog that is progressively cleared by the military. I mean, as long as you get into in war, but also through other knowledge you get from politically, you can really defeat the enemy by exploiting what is still unknown. And that's why von Clausewitz actually says, if you really want to fight a war, well, the best thing is for it to be, brutal as much as it can be for the political mandate that you have, the moral forces you have. Because if you waste time, you're basically making a gift to the enemy and basically letting him regain all what he doesn't know currently, and to fortify better, right? So war should be like fast and brutal to be effectively humanitarian, right? Von Clausewitz begins the Vom Kriege saying, it's a delusion to believe that we should maybe in a war like fight a bit less roughly, because in this way maybe the war will be less harmful to everybody involved. I mean, militarily and as civilians. Von Clausewitz says completely false. If you really care about human life in the first place, you have this to be quick and brutal, because otherwise that will escalate into something else that will drag you into and at a point you will not be able to even to control that, and more people will die effectively because it will protract itself, it will complicate itself dramatically. So there is a bit of a reckless behavior, if you want, that is courage effectively, and that von Clausewitz praises in fact as the most noble of feelings in that regard, even if courage itself is basically meaningless. Like wars, this delusion that wars are won by the most courageous basically has nothing to do with if that was the matter, we would simply settle wars on the basis of who is more courageous. Like, okay, let's play a Russian roulette and see what and we'll blows his brains out the soonest or gives up, right? And that's not how it works. And guess why? Because courage alone is it's basically you get your face smashed at the first single problem, and which, if you're still lucky to be alive at that point, will force you without asking twice to use your brains, and if you don't, you're dead, definitively, right? But it does. There is no you're not asked for permission before, right? And you can't be wrong twice at that point. So it's that brutal, and that's why paradoxically we have to act in this way. So what von Clausewitz is saying here, by the way, in the second half of the phrase, because this is all a giant phrase, basically in the paragraph, is substantially that we have to give up that pretense of knowing everything before and accepting that we have to entrust war to genius, to the military genius, right? Not to the warrior. That's just another invention of later times. By the way, not even in German. In von Clausewitz, German Kriege is effectively the warrior as it's intended today, within a kind of a tribalistic fashion. Krieger simply means the man of war, meaning as, you could even translate it as a fighter in the sense of a military man that fights, right? Not in the fact of being the warrior, like the tribal, and this thing that we have re-assumed from from the dust of ineffectiveness, and that will not work, especially in this moment in history when you think about war. But we keep making that mistake too, in some ways. But that's normal. I mean, that actually at least confirms the Clausewitzian reality to be true. That is, in fact, that warriors proper are the guys that actually normally get defeated proper by other people that are soldiers, for example, and that use their mind, not their courage, right? And that's how it basically works, historically speaking, by all standards. So these are powerful statements. I mean, von Clausewitz is, if you read this phrase from, not having come from the before, I don't know whether you watched this video for the first time. I mean, if you have listened all the path we have taken from the beginning, right? This is a pretty heavy statement, right? You came from not knowing what he wrote before. You say, damn, what is? I mean, is this guy crazy? What is the genius? How can I entrust it to someone who doesn't calculate, right? The genius does calculate his own way, though. Something you can't frame into a science, but it is merely an art. That's the point, right? Which still, and by the way, art does entail scientific knowledge. Let's not get von Clausewitz wrong. It does entail knowledge, rationality, science in the sense of, like, I must get scientific objective knowledge about something that I can, however, use It's like a recipe, and all the ingredients you can use to effectively put into practice, because the single scientific element doesn't tell you how this thing will go, or at least it could tell you. Like if you had a ton of that, and you could be able intellectually to solve, like in this giant system, as if it was an easy thing. Well, we can't do that. Our brains are not structured to solve systems that go even after a certain, I mean, instinctively, and at least it takes time, right? It takes a lot of time. Even a certain amount of variables, you can imagine with infinite variables, like reality effectively is what this is. But of course there are not quite. This is also how von Clausewitz refers to this, is that there are variables that usually are combined in a way that you can more or less look at, knowing that they interact in a certain fashion. But which measure that variable has, well, you don't know it until you see it, and in the case you see it, you may not be able to get it immediately. So it's, war is that complicated, and there is this continuous refusal from, I don't know, our side to say that we have been bred in this kind of positivistic, modernistic, rationalistic idea of reality, and 2 + 2 makes 4, and that's all I need, because that's what will solve everything. No. Actually, we do live constantly without calculating a good nothing in scientific terms. Which is strange. I mean, you could, but cognitively speaking, that's what we do. And our brain can do it. That's the thing. I mean, this is not. That's why von Clausewitz is not just a magic wizard saying, "Oh, okay, there is the genius. This is the jolly, right?" And I win with that when I play cards. And I don't explain what genius is. No, because we actually know. I mean, neurologically, speaking, that our brains are capable. That our brain is capable of doing certain things, like having immediate reflexes of getting making a synthesis of such an enormous amount of data that our calculators scientifically can't fully cope with, in the sense that we are programmed to cope with the unknown, which is what science is not able of doing, in the sense that science is increased by our mind capacity of guessing certain things. Science is a method, a language, an instrument, if you want, right? But it's humans that operate it, because otherwise there wouldn't be intuition, there wouldn't be the cognition of of realizing that 2 + 2 makes 4. The awareness, I don't know how to say that, right? The consciousness to do that. And that's why von Clausewitz is I mean, he's not a humanist proper, but he's obviously putting humanity here at the center of the whole equation. Here, it doesn't matter to have, lots of information stored somewhere that you can't frame in that sense when it comes to the immediacy of reality and how that can disrupt everything from a moment to another. If you're lucky, you have your brain there, and definitely your brain can be fed with a lot of information that you should have. You should have at all times, but you are the one who sorts that out, if he's capable. Calculators will not do that for you at that point. This is very subtle, even if you think about artificial intelligence and other things that we could discuss about that, because there are, objectively, we arrived at a moment that sees the, I'm not talking about, toys like drones or, even the most sophisticated ones, but I'm talking about massive systems of calculation. For example, I don't know how the markets will go, but we managed to create things that really predict how certain things will go. In the absence, for example, of a major catastrophe. But think about coronavirus. That is something that still that sophisticated calculator could have not guessed. Like it says, okay, the calculator works in the absence of a major regional destabilization of some sort, and yeah, and this happens, and you say, then what the hell did I use this calculator for? If you can even calculate such a massive thing that will impact the world dramatically, because this is reality. The calculator doesn't know that, and is not smart to do it, right? Humans do instead, and all calculators that we have can work by themselves to sort certain things out, but it's basically a bet. It's not that that calculator has a real conscience at that point, a real ingenuity and genius to say, okay, well, but let's take something else into consideration. It's a magic mirror that answers all your questions right? No. And the closest we have in actual reality is our brain, and nobody gives a damn about it. That's why we dramatically understand humanity all the time. All the time, from the simplest things to the most complex ones, and that's where we'll have to invest. Because that's all we have. And we discovered that very often, exactly moments when you realize that everything is precarious. That, yeah, you're alive by now, but it's not that you have to take it for granted. And von Clausewitz knew this too, in the sense he said, usually humans are lazy. Let's be honest about that. Humans, if they're not stimulated by something, if they're not pressured by something, they basically stay there, like mozzarellas, like nothing else, right? They need to be stimulated, because that's when they're reminded effectively that there is a real world there, that they're mortal, that they're aging, that something has to happen, that they have to live their lives in a way that they can't benefit from some way, or the society can benefit from some way, right? And yeah, that's literally it. And that's and what's the situation in which this is most evident? Well, war is pretty much a good one. Then when the first bullet flies over your head, you start understanding that literally there are certain things that matter more. And nobody teaches you but experience. Because at that point, it's not that, a bullet flew over your head, and then you open a manual, start wondering, and you make, oh my god, what was this? You open a manual, you find a bullet flying over your head, and you read what's that, and you say, oh, no, I understood. No, that's dangerous, that's risky. No, you already know it. You know it immediately. And nobody told you. But your human nature and experience. Nothing else. And that's how it is in war, because the moment the bullet flew over your head, did you calculate its trajectory, physically speaking? Calculate how much energy it had, or from which distance was shot, or which angle of the parabola of the trajectory had, or something like that? Hell no. And you don't even care about it, honestly. And you don't need to. Or at least you could know that theoretically, to say, okay, let's sort out which kind of weapon it is. But how much time do you have if another bullet flies, like another second from it, and maybe it hits you? Maybe instead of wondering which gun it was, maybe it was better you got down. So that's the thing. And that's how messed up it is, really, but that's why this work tells it to you straight. In a way that teaches you to be more awake, let's say more conscious, more aware, let's say better, that it's that level of uncertainty and unpredictability, and that therefore you have to heavily rely on experiences. Experience, knowledge as well, reason as well, but also courage, also other qualities that, not even just sheer courage, but a particular type, for example, is determination. And lots of other things, it can change, right, at every moment, because not every situation is like another one. So this is I hope, when I talk about these things, first of all, I don't know how many of you actually listen to me, because I didn't check it from the analytics of the videos. I don't know how many actually agree with this. I don't know how many actually get it in the first place, because the problem is mine here to be understood. So I consider myself as a, as a deliverer that also, in fact, has to be some sort of effective. But I care about, let's say, more than else, because maybe, I don't know, this is my way of expressing myself. I don't know what to, but of getting you in the right mental track. Like, if you never approach this stuff, if you legitimately have doubts, but at least to adapt you, like, I don't know, like an harmony, like a correspondence of a very delicate, very fragile, sounds, right? That really can change at every moment. This is the track that von Clausewitz follows, but at the same time, that's pretty damn consistent, right? It's not fragile because it's just an experiment, see how it goes. No, it's fragile because you need to go straight towards that line, through that line. And it's not easy, right? Because we are regularly, let's say, going straight from that line by default, as humans, in fact. But we also have the capacity of following that track, and it's not easy. But as long as that track does exist, it's the difference that passes between thinking that basically nothing has a value and that something has, but you has still to get to understand how and which measure, right? There's a huge difference, right? It's very easy, almost cowardly, to be nihilistic. I don't think there is any intellectual pride from being nihilist. It doesn't, a true nihilist in the first place should kill him or herself, because that's what you live for. You can't say, what you don't live for, because you're still, what difference does it make at that point? If you don't believe in anything, you should be. You're probably bothered that, but everything that happens, even the slightest variation of what happens around you, right? And instead, true humanity and true intelligence lays in trying to. And we know it's how humans are actually designed for, so that's also why nihilism is pretty kind of silly ideology. Like everything that ends in ism, it's pretty silly, because we do know, behaviorally, neurologically, biologically speaking, we are attracted by chaos. Like, humans are not made to sit there, and they progressively get lazy and slow down, but they're always attracted by something. They're always searching for something that, even, when they're fine, they're attracted from the thing that is messed up because they want to solve it, right? That's what we are, generally speaking, and that's what made things progressing, because before you sorted that out, I don't know, people died, countries were destroyed, and lots of things happened, but at the same time you understood something in the end, and that's the brutal promise of civilization, that you could be destroyed. Like, civilization is not to exist forever, but if you survive, you surely know something. You can make treasure of that that realization. That is destined to pass as well, right? But as long as things function normally, like a society grows and it keeps on, humans tend to better their own situation, and this meat grinder continues on, and we evolve in some way. Not that there is a necessarily a teleological point of arrival, there is really not, but apparently, it's still what made us live better than ever in last times or so, and because we had that progressed knowledge that passed through by the way, some of the most horrifying chapters about civilization, but that was still civilization in the measure we were able to learn from it. and that's a great promise that everybody can learn. So we're not passive observers. We can't. That's what von Clausewitz is telling us. We can't pretend like to eliminate the reality we are immersed in, just pretending that the world could work. We could make the world work the way we want by coming out of the world that is abstracting everything and pretending it's all about this theory of understanding everything in theory, because the world goes on without you at that point and you lag behind. Yeah, this is really the concept, the main idea here. But and that's what I hoped. In fact, that this is clear. That this is what you can get at the end of the day from Clausewitz. Alright, well, I don't add anything because I don't think at this point there is any need. But I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.